Welcome to the history of true love romance at Mills and Swoon. The letters that became a love story, Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning. In the middle of the 19th century, when England still believed that respectable women should remain quietly indoors and poets were expected to suffer nobly in obscurity, a love story began with a letter. Elizabeth Barrett was already a celebrated poet by the time Robert Browning first wrote to her in 1845. She was also chronically ill, deeply sheltered, and living under the suffocating authority of a domineering father who forbade his children to marry. From her room in Wimpole Street, she lived a life that was intellectually rich but physically constrained, surrounded by books, manuscripts, and the protective concern of family members who feared that even mild excitement might worsen her fragile health. Robert Browning was very different. Younger, energetic, and not yet widely recognized, he admired Elizabeth's poetry intensely. After reading her work, he sent her a letter that has since become one of the most famous opening lines in literary romance. "I love your verses with all my heart," he wrote. It was bold, perhaps even presumptuous, but it was sincere. Elizabeth, who had spent years believing that illness had closed the door on any conventional romantic future, was both surprised and intrigued. Their correspondence began cautiously. At first, the letters were polite exchanges between two poets discussing literature and ideas. But gradually, the tone changed. Admiration deepened into affection, and affection into something far more powerful. Over time, the letters became confessions of emotional dependence, intellectual companionship, and a growing sense that each had discovered in the other a rare kind of understanding. Eventually, Robert asked to meet her. Elizabeth was nervous. She had been an invalid for years and was convinced that she was too fragile, too pale, too confined to inspire real affection. Yet when Robert arrived at her home in Wimpole Street, the meeting transformed both their lives. He was captivated not only by her poetry, but by her mind. Elizabeth, in turn, discovered that Robert's admiration was not a fleeting literary enthusiasm, but something more steadfast and determined. Their relationship, however, faced a formidable obstacle. Elizabeth's father, Edward Barrett, ruled his household with absolute authority and had forbidden all his children from marrying. The reasons for this strange decree have never been fully understood, but the effect was unmistakable. None of the Barrett children dared defy him. Elizabeth knew that if her father discovered the romance, the consequences would be severe. And yet the relationship continued. For months, Robert visited her secretly, while their letters grew increasingly passionate. Slowly, Elizabeth's health seemed to improve, as though emotional hope itself were a form of medicine. Finally, in 1846, the couple decided that secrecy could no longer sustain them. They would marry. The wedding itself was quiet and almost conspiratorial. Elizabeth slipped away from her father's house one morning and met Robert at St. Marylebone Church, where they were married in a simple ceremony. But the real drama came afterwards. For a week, Elizabeth continued living at home, pretending nothing had happened. Then one day, she gathered her courage, left the house with her small dog Flush, and joined Robert. Together, they fled England for Italy, where they settled in Florence. Edward Barrett never forgave her. He refused to see her again and returned all her letters unopened. Yet the marriage that had cost Elizabeth her father's approval became one of the most celebrated literary partnerships in history. In Florence, the couple lived a life filled with writing, conversation, travel, and mutual encouragement. Elizabeth's health improved dramatically, and she produced some of her most famous work during these years. Among her poems was a sequence that would become perhaps the most famous love poetry in the English language, Sonnets from the Portuguese. One line in particular has echoed across generations. "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." It is easy to forget that the poem was not an abstract meditation, but a declaration written to the man who had once sent a daring letter to a woman he had never met. Robert Browning loved Elizabeth Barrett not only as a poet, but as a person who had believed her life would be confined to a single room. With him, she travelled, wrote, laughed, and discovered that love could be both an emotional rescue and an intellectual partnership. Their story reminds us that romance is not always about dramatic gestures or sudden passion. Sometimes it begins quietly with admiration, grows through conversation, and survives through courage. And occasionally, it begins with a single letter from one poet to another, confessing, with charming simplicity, "I love your verses with all my heart." You have been listening to a True Love podcast by Tale Teller Club Publishing.